Good afternoon to everybody and welcome to this event. I'm Caroline Hyder. I'm the Director General of the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank Group. So welcome to all of the participants in the room as well as online. We're web streaming this event, and I believe we have quite a number of people who are following us from afar, sometimes maybe even from the World Bank Group offices because it's lousy weather outside and the people don't want to make their way across the road. We are talking today about the rural non-farm economy. As you can tell, that's a little bit of a mouthful. There are And as we were doing this evaluation, it was challenging to even define exactly what that entails and what that sector looks like. So some of you might say, like, well, if that's such a strange animal, why did you even venture into doing the evaluation? And if you've picked up this brochure, it tells you in a nutshell exactly why. There is a part of the economy, it's the poor in rural areas. They are where actually the most severe poverty occurs, according to a number of studies and statistics. And these people are, while they live in the rural areas, not necessarily doing only farming. They have only a portion of their income from farming activities. And what that means is that there is another part of the economy that is not farm-based, not farming in itself, but maybe related to farming, where people generate income. And we wanted to make sure that this group of the population does not get forgotten as we move forward in trying to achieve reduced poverty or eliminated poverty, or in terms of boosting shared prosperity. So that was the motivation. The evaluation fits into our overall program of work that focuses on inclusive growth. So we did not, inclusive and sustainable growth, as I should say, we did not want to sort of like leave a gap here where it is important for the World Bank Group and other stakeholders like IFAD to ensure that they play the role they need to play. We have the pleasure of having a very interesting panel here, and Jose Carbajo, the director who leads the department where this evaluation was produced, will introduce the panelists for an exciting discussion of the findings, which Lauren Kelly, the task team leader, will be introducing. I think we had hoped that Ede was going to come and do also welcome remarks, but he's very busy and he might be caught up in another meeting. So I would suggest maybe we go on to starting the presentation, and when he comes, then you can just make space for him to welcome everybody. So over to you, Lauren.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming. It's great to see such interest in this room on the rural non-farm economy. It's a topic that doesn't always get so much buzz, so maybe this is foreshadowing things to come. I want to start just by thanking very much the panel that's assembled here. I want to recognize also the evaluation panel. Very supportive, very helpful. We have Steve Hogblade, who was also a member of our panel. Nora Dudwick is in the room, senior social scientist. And Peter Landjau, who I think you all know, who couldn't make it. He's on sabbatical in the Netherlands. Before I begin, I also want to recognize my co-TTL, Andy Stone, in the front row. Thank you very much, Andy. And my great team. And I had 30 people. I'm not going to mention all the names, but I've got Pallavi and Sama and other people that I saw here today. So thank you so much for your support. And Vibhuti, thank you. Okay. So I'm going to organize this presentation into 3 parts. A brief overview of the rural non-farm economy, just to get us started. The findings of the evaluation, and then we're going to do a forward look. And I'll start by saying, as Caroline suggested, that the rural non-farm economy is complex because it's not a sector, it's a theme. And it's a topic that's defined both spatially and functionally. Spatially because it exists in rural areas, but it's still tricky, right? Because rural is defined many different ways depending on which country you're in. But also functionally based on the kind of activities. Many rural non-farm activities occur along the agricultural value chain, agro-processing, marketing, transport, okay? This depends on the structure of the economy. But they also occur outside of agriculture, manufacturing, construction, tourism, even self-employment. And like Caroline also said, the reason why we're here today is because there's increasing evidence that the rural non-farm economy can contribute to poverty reduction, to income diversification and increased resilience. It also can contribute to labor market efficiency by pulling unproductive labor off the farm and into the rural non-farm economy. So there's a lot we can use our work on the rural non-farm economy for. Increasingly, as we discuss sustainable urbanization and migration, it's also worth noting that the rural non-farm economy deserves increased attention. Why? Because, in effect, some of the tools we've used in the past won't work in the future. We all know that, for example, there's changing patterns of migration. For decades now, for example, if I'm West African, I might use migration as a tool, okay, migration to Europe for my earnings. Those kind of dynamics are no longer possible. So in this evolving space, the rural non-farm economy becomes extremely important. Lastly, I'll say that in this space, for the rural poor to benefit, we need to pay attention to not just to the activities that we're financing, but to a host of enabling factors that need to be present for the rural poor to participate in this economy. These factors include everything from from literacy to access to rural finance, to rural connectivity, and even to identity. We have to pay attention to exclusion, and identity, for example, gender effects, and other factors. Lastly, in terms of presenting an overview of the rural non-farm economy, I'll just point to this schematic that's really stood the test of time. This is the schematic from the World Development Report 2008 on agriculture. And I'm going to turn this over to Ede. Great timing.
Okay. This is all-time coordination.
Thank you for coming.
I love it.
Okay.
Sorry for the delay. Great to see. Oh my goodness, this is such an exciting room, all full together. Because when this event was organized, like, who's going to come to this topic? Because it falls between the cracks of so many of our GPs. Part of the problem on rural development has been that actually it's not just agriculture, it's the non-farm economy. It's trying to figure out how do you connect infrastructure. Is that connectivity between rural, small towns, growth centers, cities all together. Now, we are going to be learning a lot out of this report on a variety of topics. And let me tell you what we're trying to push a lot in many of these places, and it's really coming back in a new way into territorial development. Meaning, how do you actually, instead of looking at a specific sector just because they are in the rural environment, how do you help, let's say, governors of provinces think about the development of those territories? How do you break that barrier between, which is our mental barrier, between rural and urban? This fiction that if you are standing here, you are an urban citizen. If you walk 100 meters, now you are a rural citizen. That doesn't exist anymore. Okay? How do you actually help, for example, all those governors where the One Belt, One Road huge mega projects on across, how do you help them figure out ways to take advantage of that infrastructure to develop the rural economy in practical ways? What are the infrastructure supplements they need to do? How do you think about the agriculture? How do you think about the potential areas for growth into these areas? How do you make it work? Okay? Now, this study, what it allows is to take a step back and learn what is it that we're doing in different places. And now that we are into this new structure of global practices, is how do we develop platforms that allows us to come together and to everybody bring their expertise to bring new perspectives to clients. And for us, the main client is either the governor of the province or the Ministry of Planning, the one that is able to connect all across. Because, look, the Ministry of Transport is interested in roads, okay? The Ministry of Agriculture is interested in making sure that food is produced. The Ministry of Urban Development is interested maybe in the small towns. But those are not our counterparts thinking about the rural economy altogether. So we are in this frontier question, and what we discuss, what we found out of these initial conversations is that many of the issues that were separate in different parts of the organization are beginning to connect in really interesting ways. So, for example, a lot of the conflict areas, the subnational conflicts that we see, are basically exclusions at the territorial level. Certain parts of the nation and territories are excluded because generally either racial or religious or cultural dimensions, and therefore levels of investments have led them into lagging regions. So that connection between lagging lands and violent lands is very close. Second, for example, issues of indigenous peoples' development or ethnic minorities' development actually is very much an issue of territorial, rural development. In the process of thinking, so we tend to think, all right, so a little bit of community-driven development to build the services, that should be enough. And in reality, that doesn't lift these communities out of poverty. And therefore, how do you bring the social dimensions, the territorial planning, the infrastructure planning into a single coherent structure to try to move into this process? So there are all these internal barriers that unfortunately we create within the World Bank to say, how do we lift them? And it's not that we're losing our specialty. One of the problems that we had in the old rural development projects was that it was such a Christmas tree that nobody knew what we're doing. And therefore, the image that I use is to say, look, it's not that we're all now going to be territorial development specialists. We are, and therefore we're all mixed into this, but it's rather we are moving from closed offices to cubicles. In a cubicle, you have your space and you know what you're good at, and you bring that technical specialty to what you do, but you are able to see what everybody else is doing in the floor, and therefore you're able to connect into this process. You don't like my office? Exactly. It's a mental barrier to say you cannot lose your technical specialist. You have to be an agricultural specialist. You have to be a transport specialist. You have to be an urban planner. You have to be really a good solid economist. But you need to be able to lower the barriers, to lower the walls of your cubicles to connect all across into this process. So these are a few thoughts on how we are trying to build these platforms. And from GSUR, it's not so much to lead the territorial agenda, but it's really try to facilitate coordination in the territorial agendas. It's becoming super important in MENA, for example, because of the linkage of decentralization, of territorial development, of productivity, of lagging regions. It becomes important in conflict areas such as Colombia and the Philippines and middle-income countries, because the conflicts that they've had is really very much linked to rural territories left behind. Is becoming very important in the One Belt, One Road process, because once you have those connectivities and those infrastructure, actually everybody think, this is a fantastic thing, but in reality, all these products from China are going to be coming, and therefore the economies of those countries may collapse if they don't think through what is it that they need to do to build into this process. So many of those frontier issues, and we're super happy that you spend, 2-3 years into this process, really having that discipline of the analysis to be able for us to take those lessons, and to be able to now use them in very practical ways in our new thinking. So much thank you for the invitation. Okay.
All right, now that you've been inspired, I'm going to have to bring you back to some of the obstacles. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Eddie. All right, so just to wrap up what we're talking about here, a little of the context on the rural non-farm economy, and we'll get right into the findings. This slide really does present sort of the framework for the evaluation, insofar as we utilized the WDR 2008 3 worlds. What this allowed us to do is understand how the rural non-farm economy presents itself across different stages of structural transformation. And in so doing, what it allowed us to do is to try to better understand how the World Bank Group could engage, along this paradigm. So very different sort of opportunities in agrarian areas where the rural non-farm is intrinsically linked to smallholder productivity, from urbanized areas, for example, where you have the pull from the city for labor demand, et cetera. So keep that in mind as we go through some of our findings. The first finding really is that the rural non-farm economy has been a foundational, a very important part of a lot of the World Bank Group's agricultural strategies, for 15 years. It was part of the Reaching the Rural Poor program that we did up until the financial crisis and the food crisis. After that, it was featured in our agricultural action plans. So it's really the rural non-farm economy has been present all along. It's featured in IFC's work on agribusiness through its agribusiness action plan, et cetera. So what we found first is that, this is a topic that really has been given a lot of importance by the World Bank Group in its strategies. The second thing we wanted to do in this evaluation was to understand both where the rural non-farm economy exists in the World Bank Group and what we meant by rural non-farm activities. And this was challenging. We looked over 10 years at all World Bank Group projects, representing about $46 billion Inside those projects, what we were able to see is that the rural non-farm activities that we finance exist across the World Bank and the IFC. It exists across GPs, okay? And we were also able to develop some typologies for study. The most frequently occurring rural non-farm activity takes place in our value chain work, okay, linked to agriculture. But we have many more activities that we discovered in SIR, in our community-driven development projects, for example, that feature income-generating and asset creation aspects. We found them in social protection in our productive inclusion approaches, environment, macro, and TNC. These are the most frequently occurring, and so as Eddie had suggested, this is an agenda that really spans GPs. And from that portfolio review, from that analysis, what we discovered, and this is one of the highlights of our evaluation, is that we identified two main ways that the World Bank Group does business, okay? And we call these divergent paths. And in studying this way that the World Bank Group does business, we discovered a gap. And the gap is this. On the one hand side, we are financing a lot of rural non-farm economic activities in projects that do poverty approaches, poverty targeting. All right. They're reaching the rural poor. They're delivering services. They're increasing resilience. That's happening. But what those programs are not doing is necessarily achieving sustained income effects to lift the rural poor out of poverty in a sustainable way. On the other side, we have growth programs. And these programs are achieving good effects. These are mostly value chains. They're increasing sales. They're increasing revenues, etc. But what we don't understand enough about in terms of these projects is the distributional impacts. The links to the rural poor are not evident necessarily. Intergroup dynamics are not necessarily evident, etc. So what we needed to do is understand also a lot more information on these approaches on how they affect the local economy. Over time, what we found is that there's also a need to think about the expansion of our growth approaches, the value chains. And we know that portfolio has expanded immensely over time in the last 10 years. But also the decline of those poverty projects. So we know there's a gap, and we know there's a need to think about how to minimize that gap. But we also want to study why over time we've seen a growth of one typology versus the other that reduces our poverty, that may reduce our poverty impacts. To give you a flavor, I'm just going to run through some of our most frequently occurring programs, just to give some spice to the evaluation. You know, there's three main poverty approaches that we studied in this evaluation. One was the rural livelihoods in South Asia, community-driven development, which occurs globally, and also our social protection projects that have productive inclusion aspects. And what we find here is that, and I'll begin with rural livelihoods, is that these programs have really had incredibly strong social outcomes. They have engaged millions and millions of women, and they have empowered groups of women to be able to help themselves. We know that there's been increased access to credit, or access to credit for the first time. We know that there's been strong service delivery in this way. And the data shows that we have consumption smoothing. Women are better able to weather shock and also invest in health and education for their children and their families. What we see in this modality is that, however, at the time of the evaluation, we hadn't yet moved these programs to a place where they could, across the board, say that they were achieving sustainable increases in income or asset creation for the rural poor. However, when we look at more advanced models, we think that there is great potential for this model to deepen in phase to achieve more economic gains. In CDD, we looked at programs that had an income generation focus, not all CDD. Some CDD just, deliver services. They also work in conflict-affected spaces. These projects, though, had an income-increasing aim. There's a couple of things about this product line that's very interesting. One is they're often in the ag and rural space. Thanks, Eddie. In the ag and rural space, they often have agricultural interventions and rural non-farm interventions. What we can say about these interventions is that they're doing well in measuring the agricultural parts of those projects. We know that there's increased ag productivity. What we don't know necessarily is how the rural enterprises are doing, because we're not measuring the profitability or sustainability of the rural investments in these CDD projects that are outside of the agricultural space. When we do have evidence, we know they're often not sustained after project close. And when we do have evidence, we know that the reason why we don't have more sustained income effects over time is that they are confronted with several binding constraints related to rural market integration, rural infrastructure, and governance issues. Lastly, the last kind of typology that we discovered was a new approach in social protection called productive inclusion. Productive inclusion is an effort by our social protection teams to go beyond transfers. It seeks to build income and asset creation in rural areas, and particularly to graduate folks out of poverty. The idea here is that, in effect, our labor economists are trying to go beyond the transfer system. Here we found the same kind of binding constraints that we found in our C2D portfolio. So in effect, we feel there's a lot the two programs can learn from one another. On the growth side, most of the bank's work is in the value chains, okay? And here what we find is that, again, like I said earlier, a lot of good evidence on the fact that there's increased sales, revenues, and even income creation. But what we found is that there's a lack of attention ex ante to poverty and gender, okay, in these projects. We also found that there's a lack of analysis of value chain efficiency, meaning we know that there's more production, we know that there's increased sales, but what about the value chain itself? What do we know is happening across the chain in terms of bringing more value down the chain? And also, what about the middleman? So in effect, what we were really looking for in these projects is to learn over time, how are we getting more value chain efficiency? We also would like to see more data and more studies on the effects on the local rural economy, the secondary effects, the spillover effects, to learn more about this approach. I'll just mention, because I have some folks in the room that work on these, Mike and Alexander's here, the productive partnership approaches that we studied in Latin America. These were the most rigorously evaluated value chain projects, and we appreciate that. They're working with CGIAR, particularly with CIAT, to do that kind of evaluation. And in so doing, we've been able to get more information out of these projects than others. Okay, it's an innovation that requires more study, but an innovation that actually addresses the binding constraints to contractual arrangements. However, even in these productive partnerships arrangements that have been piloted in the Latin American region, we're looking for more information on distributional impacts, sex disaggregated data, and also information on the difference between the commodity lines that we're supporting. For example, more mature coffee cooperatives versus perishables, and that's important to learn. IFC has had very positive impacts, okay, when it has worked horizontally to make investments in rural areas across the value chains. We see evidence of employment effects in rural areas when you have horizontal integration. When you have vertically integrated investments, however, the links to the rural poor are less evident, okay? Blended finance, and particularly through the Global Agricultural Food Security Program, has helped to bring the IFC closer to the rural poor and into the rural space to make those investments more feasible. In these projects, we have two findings. One is very much like the World Bank. We don't see enough in project design to identify, target, or track the poor or the effects on the value chains on the poor. And also, we noted that we'd like to see more explicitly reference to risks related to market structure and market power ex ante, for example, in board documents. And in so doing, then, how these risks could be mitigated. Last two findings, 30 seconds on each. We looked at all of the analytical work of the World Bank and the country programs. On the analytical side, what we found is that the World Bank has recognized the importance of the rural non-farm economy. DEC has been one of our leaders in this space. A lot of work has been done, but it's been sporadic, funded by trust funds, and it has not been sustained. If we're going to have good data over time, we need to think about how we're going to sustain these efforts. And on the country program side, what we found is that by looking at the time, all of the systematic country diagnostics that had been produced and the older CASs, that what we tend to see is that country programs, particularly in countries where you have high rates of rural poverty, are not necessarily pursuing an integrated approach like Ede had suggested in the past towards developing the rural non-farm economy. Services are being delivered to rural areas, but as part of sector programs. And so what you're not seeing is a good diagnostic of rural geography, population dynamics, etc. The new urban agenda offers an opportunity to engage in this, the development of secondary cities. But how far down they go into reaching beyond the secondary city is a question that we'd like to pose. Lastly, just to mention, Pradeep Mitra is not here. He did our work on Bangladesh. We really look at Bangladesh as a model. Bangladesh really stands out in terms of the way our country program thought about holistically the rural non-farm economy by helping Bangladesh to layer rural services so that we tackled the enabling environment holistically. Everything from rural electrification to rural literacy, primary and secondary, to rural finance. So that as Bangladesh has been able to reduce its poverty, it's done so by doing that through both the farm and the non-farm economy. Okay, so this leads us to 6 recommendations that we made for the World Bank Group. And because we don't have much time, I'm going to go right to the forward steps that we're taking. The World Bank Group. The World Bank Group management agreed with IEG on all six of its recommendations. Before I turn this event over to my esteemed panel, I'll just point to some of these areas of agreement, because this will really form the basis for what we'll be working on with our colleagues in management over the next 5 years through our management action process. Okay? And that is that there's an agreement that there's a need to think about strategically about the rural non-farm economy through a framework approach, but that also this is something that really needs to inform our systematic country diagnostics to take that opportunity to really inform them where the rural non-farm economy is important to reduce rural poverty. There's also this idea of working harder together through the GSGs, for example, to think about, the Global Solution Groups in the World Bank, to think about the ways that we're going to tailor projects to the stage and nature of areas' structural transformation. So that's the graph I showed you. Third, we all know that we need to better track income effects, and there's been a commitment to do more of this, also through an increase in impact evaluations in our farm and non-farm activities. IFC made a statement that they will keep working to integrate poverty and gender considerations into its investments and also attend to market risks that they also agree is important. And lastly, on gender, we had a strong recommendation on gender. We found that gender is being well integrated into projects. It's being well integrated in terms of how many women are participating. What we don't know necessarily, though, is how women are benefiting from the productive activities in the rural non-farm economy. So the World Bank Group has agreed to continue to strengthen its analysis by identifying gender gaps and addressing these gaps in project design, and by continuing to work on collecting sex disaggregated data on economic impacts. Okay, that's our evaluation. Thank you. Now we have Paul Ev, and it's self-explanatory.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and thank you to Caroline and Ede for the opening remarks and the welcoming commentary as well. So it is my task to moderate this afternoon's debate, and I think that we are very lucky. And I feel lucky as a moderator because we have a panel which is well represented in the sense that we have ownership, we have management, we have academia, and we have a very interesting topic in front of us. Now, how am I going to do it is going to be the following. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and then I'm going to ask a specific question, allowing them to answer the question and then make additional comments for anything that they may have picked up from the presentation. And then after that, we will open the floor for questions from the floor, from the audience here in the room, and then we will be also picking up those who are following this presentation online. So, first and foremost, the objective of this panel discussion, apart from reflecting from the findings of the IEG evaluation, is to try and address. In IEG, we like to think in terms of overarching questions, right? We always think of what is the overarching question. So the overarching challenge that we have this afternoon is how do we see the rural non-farm economy evolving up to 2030, and what is it that the World Bank Group should do about it? Okay, so to massage that question and see how we go about it, I'm going to start with my first member of the panel, who, out of courtesy and also because they approve our budget, I think we should start with ownership. So my far left, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jürgen Sattler, who is the executive director for Germany at the World Bank Group. He's in that role since May 2017, so he's a new kid in the block, so to speak. Jürgen is a development specialist and macroeconomist with more than 30 years of international experience. He's been Deputy Director General for Multilateral European Policy in the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, also Head of Division at World Bank and IMF on debt-related issues, and Deputy Head of Division for WTO on trade policy. He has also private and public sector experience, both in European Commission and in private banking in Germany. He holds a PhD in economics from University of Gießen. So the context to my question, Jürgen, is the following. By 2030, remember, this is our brainchild, most of the world's extreme poor will be concentrated in Africa, mostly in rural areas. While some countries, like, say, Rwanda and to some extent Ethiopia, are showing signs of a strong structural transformation, And by that, I mean increased labor productivity in agriculture, releasing that labor into non-farm activities, coupled with an industrial pool of underemployed rural labor into more productive activities. This transformation, this structural transformation has not happened at a scale and across the number of countries need to have really a delta, a proper, robust change. So this is a question for you, Jürgen. Based on the findings of this evaluation and your involvement in initiatives like the G20 Compact for Africa, what is it that the World Bank Group can do to foster a more sustainable and inclusive transition, especially in those so-called low-income and slow-transforming countries?
Thank you, Jose. You're right. We are approving the budget, and therefore you should give me the floor first. But this helps, but there is no automaticity.
Okay.
So you want to know the role of the World Bank in that context. But perhaps first I say a few words what this means, structural transformation for Africa, and what role the rural non-farm economy can play in that context. So I think we all assume that structural transformation takes place like we have seen it in many countries, industrialized countries, but also in China and perhaps in Vietnam. And it means that there is some productivity increase in agriculture, but there is surplus labor, and the surplus labor goes to the urban centers. And then there is some demand coming, and this gives a boost to agriculture, gives a boost to the non-farm economy in the rural areas. And but this means that agriculture has a central role to play, because then the demand comes from the agriculture. And the first step is to increase productivity in agriculture. I think now there is the big debate. Did this change this concept because of new technology? Did it change? That's the big discussion at the moment. So I think most would assume it won't happen in the future like that because of the new technology, because of many things. And you can also see many countries that this growing manufacturing sector doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen in Africa. There are some promising signs in Rwanda, as you said, in Ethiopia, but it will not happen at that scale. So this is a problem. But what does this mean for agriculture and the non-rural farm economy? To my point of view, it means that this is even more important, because if it's not agriculture as we know it, for example, textile, then perhaps the sources of growth are closer to the rural area, and it could be agribusiness, it could be agro-industry. And therefore, to my point of view, the World Bank already gives lots of focus on these issues, more than a few years ago, but give even more focus to this potential source of growth, agro-industry. And this will, the question is if this will happen in the rural areas. It could also happen in the urban areas. But you have to ask yourself, what are the income activities in the rural non-farm area? You are advocating that's a big issue, and it's a big issue. But what are the concrete? You said more analysis, yes. But what could be promising areas? And I can't see the big new issues. But one thing which is very promising, I think, is agribusiness. And there one can discuss how to promote it. But I think that's the main point I wanted to make.
Very good, Jürgen. Thank you very much. That's a very good point, focusing on the need to increase productivity and the potential for agro-industry. Now we're going to go from ownership to academia. And on my far right, we have the pleasure to count on Professor Stephen Hackblade, who is a professor in international development in the Department of Agriculture, Food and Resource Economics, Michigan State University. Stephen has spent most of his professional career working overseas on long-term assignments in places like Bangladesh, Botswana, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Madagascar, and Zambia, among others. His research and outreach interests include very much the topics of this afternoon discussion: agricultural productivity, growth and poverty reduction, so right at the heart, rural non-farm economy, supply chains that link farms and related non-farm businesses with final consumer. So to complement just the opening commentary from Jürgen, Stephen, your work on transforming the rural non-farm economy highlights precisely that, the role and the impact of rural structural transformation, the role that it can play in achieving the diversification of rural livelihoods. And your research concludes that non-farm diversification, i.e. using off-farm income, which, by the way, is often seen as a risk mitigation strategy, can facilitate investment in the farm. So that you have and in so doing, you can accelerate productivity growth and equalize returns to labor across sectors, across activities. Now, that as a background, this is the question for you. Based on your work and the findings of IEG evaluation, what can you tell us about the role and the relative importance of these links between farm and the non-farm economy, these so-called bi-directional angles? And to the extent that you can also contribute, what do you think the World Bank Group can do about it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to simplify a massive set of diverse circumstances. Three kinds of linkages that really matter, and I think three sorts of institutional models for bridging those and reinforcing those linkages. So the three major kinds of linkages you need to be thinking about are consumption linkages, production linkages, and factor market linkages. And they run, as you said, bidirectionally. In most places, with the exception of Latin America broadly, the consumption linkages dominate. When you measure empirically when agricultural growth happens, as Jürgen says, you've got a productivity boost in agriculture. What happens in the non-farm economy? And in most places, the answer is consumption linkages. That's the most powerful stimulus. It's a demand stimulus to rural non-farm activity. And so you really find this in the cotton boom areas or after the Green Revolution. You'll see big changes, housing investments, health investments. People send their kids to school. You see video rental kiosks sprouting up in small little places. It's, as the report noted, a lot of it is local service activity. So there's very clear consumption linkages from the farm to the non-farm. The same is true if you have new mining activity or a subcontract, weaving villages like you find in Thailand. You get big reciprocal demands into farming, and there it tends to be into high-value agriculture, horticulture, fresh fruits, vegetables, dairy, poultry, that kind of thing. So the consumption linkages are really important, and they've been measured in quite a few places. The production linkages. Oh, sorry. Am I?
Yeah, we could speak closer to the meeting.
Okay. All right. I'll do that. The production linkages. I think you're all aware of these. I'll just quick example. Bangladesh Green Revolution. Paddy production doubled the 10-year period, starting in the mid-'80s, from 10 to 20 million tons. Astounding growth in rural husking mills. We went out there after that, found over 90,000 of them. This is a lot. There's a lot of production links that take place. Same is true in the non-farm economy. If you set up a tomato canning plant, well, increases the input demand for tomatoes. You find a lot of unexpected links, too, when you start looking at these production links. In this Bangladesh case that I mentioned, the growth in ag productivity driven by irrigation, these small diesel-powered tube wells, well, you only need them in the dry season. So what they do in the off season is they put them on river boats. It radically transformed rural transportation services because you could physically move these motors. And so you had really a revolution in rural non-farm transport services that came from that. So in any given place, you'll find these production linkages do work both ways, and they often can be quite powerful. The third set of linkages is what I think you need to concentrate on most, and probably what not only the bank, but I'd say the world in general has been the weakest on is the factor market linkages. And for poverty concerns, those are probably the most important set of linkages. So you've got labor and capital, I think, are the two that really cut across sectors that you need to look at. It's extremely powerful. If you look at Pete Lanyo's work or Mahbub Hussain in South Asia, the Green Revolution hits, you get big changes in labor demand in agriculture, you get rising wage rates in agriculture, and if you look, what does that do to the non-farm economy? Massive shift in the composition of non-farm activities, and it comes through the wage effect. This is the most powerful tool you have, I think, for reaching the poor is these rural labor markets. So the ag wage goes up, and when Hussain and Bids and others looked at these rural non-farm activities, you saw a complete collapse of these very mindlessly labor-intensive cottage industries, the embroidery and the weaving things, where women go blind, working by candlelight late at night. They didn't have to do that anymore because they had better opportunities. So the wage rate in agriculture completely changed the opportunity cost of labor in non-farm activities, and you saw a massive shift in the composition of non-farm activities. And you saw exactly what you want to see, a collapse of the very low return dead-end opportunities, and really a flowering of the higher returns activities. These were often in service activities. So the labor market links really matter. And I want to give you a recent example of how it works in reverse, because the urban labor market affects agriculture. And particularly, as Eddie was saying, when you get into the spatial dimensions, rural towns and so on, the biggest change I've seen in West African agriculture in the last decade has been an explosion in herbicide use in farming. And so we went in all across 7 different countries to try to figure out what's going on. It's the non-farm labor market. And you see this very clearly spatially in areas where you have gold mining or you have urban commuting and opportunities to earn non-farm income. It drives up non-farm wage rates. That drives up the opportunity cost of labor in agriculture. Farmers, these young men, they can make 5 times as much in the gold mines of Guinea and Mali as they can hand weeding, which is the main labor user in agriculture. And so farmers now are shifting to herbicides. Currently, we found even small women farmers in southern Mali, over 60% use herbicides. It's half the cost of hand weeding labor. So it's an example of the power of these labor market linkages, and a lot of them are increasingly going to occur spatially, particularly as you get rural-urban migration and the rise of these rural towns. So the labor market links, I would say keep your eye on that for sure. Credit market, I'd say, is also very important, and a lot of evidence both ways. Farmers take their profits and buy trucks or build guest houses. Non-farm businesses, Mark Winters and others looked at a dozen different countries. A lot of time the non-farm income then is invested back on the farm. It becomes the vehicle for financing. Now, institutionally, you at the bank have a problem, and it's the same problem everybody on planet Earth has. I think your matrix, Lauren, really laid that out, is that the non-farm economy is an institutional orphan. You need infrastructure, you need agriculture, you need regional planning, you need education. So there are a lot of things that have to go into it. And no one institution has found an ideal model for coping with that. I think what we've found is three mechanisms for bridging across, whether it's, I don't know if cubicles, I'm not sure if that's may contribute, but I'm going to suggest three other models beyond cubicles for.
You will be happy.
Yes.
Don't give them any ideas.
Yeah. So the three models I've seen that can work very well. First one has to do with regional development, rural towns, spatial planning. Eddie talked about this, and this is not new. Urban functions and rural development, some places call them agropoles, territorial development. A lot of different terms have been used, but the basic idea is sound, that there are connections between farming and non-farm activities, and a lot of them take place in these rural towns. So some of the most effective rural development work I've seen anywhere has come in this vein, where you come in and you have a coordinating diagnostic exercise. The bank is big, but you're not big enough to handle this. So you not only have to collaborate internally, you have to collaborate externally, often with local governments, regional governments, and so on. And so you have to think about how you're going to build bridges to the outside as well as internally. So these, the best I've ever seen was what the Norwegians did in Botswana in the 1970s. It was incredible. Town and regional planning, going into some of these little towns that they thought had potential, and they did the basic planning, siting of infrastructure, the zoning, the sanitation, and they had the good fortune to do that right before the Jwaneng diamond mine went on stream. Everybody thought they were nuts to go out into these places, but they were there. You can do things in these middle-sized towns that you can't do in the capital city, because in the capital city, your vegetable markets, you're getting these huge losses because you have traffic congestion and pollution and no sanitation. In the rural towns, you don't yet have the population. You don't have to move people out of squatter settlements. So you can get in on the ground floor there. You can really have an impact. So I think this, whatever you want to call it, regional planning, territorial development, this is something you want to get involved in. It's a good way to go. The second model that does work, I won't even talk about much, is the value chains. You have a lot of experience with that. I would simply say that these can be powerful tools for increasing growth. They're not always powerful tools for helping poor people. In fact, one of the best ways to crush poor people is with a strategic value chain intervention that favors certain category of technology or procurement that limits access by the poor. So the value chain is a powerful tool for good and for evil. So you have to be careful how you apply that one. The third model, where not a lot has been done, and where I would encourage you to do some hard thinking, is in these factor markets. And I think somebody really needs to look at rural labor markets and how they work. This is the vehicle that connects poor people with opportunities. And that what poor people need is opportunities and access to them. And it's a kind of a complicated thing. So you need the opportunities, but then you need skills and assets to be able to access them. I've seen some very interesting examples coming out of Makerere University. Cotton companies have done some of the best work on this that I've seen. You need very focused training. You need some basic. Isaac Mindy did a big review of ag education in Africa, and the conclusion was you don't need a very high level of education, but you need basic numeracy and basic literacy. And from there, then you need some technical skills and aptitudes. And so a lot of the interesting work, I think, is on getting a sound basic education and then training on very specific skills, whether it's diesel mechanics or something else. You don't need university education to make this work. You need critical minimum foundation and then some skills training. And I've seen horticulture companies, the cotton companies, some of the academics do some very interesting work in this area. So labor markets, I think, in terms of how you connect, I mean, the big problem that Lauren pointed to is you do growth well and you can do poverty, but you can't connect the two together very well. And I think the way you can connect them together is through these labor markets. So I would encourage you. I have some suggestions on how you might do that, but I think that's fertile ground for exploration.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your comprehensive commentary and opening remarks. Clearly, you have set out the agenda in many respects. We in IAG like frameworks, and this idea of 3 linkages, 3 models. Listening to you about how the linkages work reminds me of one of the things that we do in any evaluation, which is to develop a theory of change. And here you are describing it very comprehensively. Thank you very much. And you have pointed out in one of the models the value change, which is exactly what we're going to turn now to. Now we have heard from ownership, we have heard from academia, now we're going to hear from management. Who says IG doesn't like management? I'm surrounded by 2 important representatives of management, and to my immediate left, it's a pleasure to introduce Lorraine Ronchi, who is the lead economist and global agribusiness lead in the Trade and Competitiveness Group of the World Bank. She was the first World Bank Group Global Solutions lead for value change and agribusiness. So we're going to hear a little bit on value change, I hope, across the World Bank Group, a role that she held between 2015 and 2017 with the Agriculture Global Practice. Now, while global lead, she set up the Cross World Bank Group Global Solutions Group for Value Change and Agribusiness, growing to a membership of almost 300 staff across 5 GPs and the IFC. So Lorraine can also talk about coordination issues that have been raised. Her focus as global lead was on regional cross-fertilization and cross-World Bank Group solution creation in the agribusiness space, of course. Now, she has also served as technical lead for agribusiness private sector development in the IFC advisory services for 3 years. So she has this good public and private sector perspective. Now, prior to joining the World Bank Group, Lorraine worked in the coffee and cocoa sectors in research, impact evaluation, and technical assistance capacities with private sector coffee and chocolate companies. She holds MPhil degrees in economics from Oxford University and her PhD also in economics from Sussex University. Now, Lorraine, thank you for being here. With the comment on value change is very apropos because the context for my question is the following. Our report has found that the support for agricultural value change and associated activities in the rural non-farm economy can achieve positive effects, as we heard, in the form of increased sales and revenue, but that the impacts on the rural poor are not necessarily always evident. They may be there, they may be not. That's another thing why we also need data, but we'll talk about data later on. Now, in the meantime, new contractual models and new forms of information technology are emerging that have the potential to link better farmers to markets and to enhance this rural poverty alleviation that we are all after. So, what is your opinion? To what extent has the World Bank Group been innovating recently, for example, through the Global Solutions Group, to learn from and to build on different approaches to improve these poverty reduction impacts? Can those approaches address issues such as agricultural value change? How can those approaches evolve also for issues such as gender, for example, where you can separate these two answers and tackle one at a time because there are 2 different topics, but Yeah, with that mini agenda, I leave the floor.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll take your 2 agenda items and raise you one on coordination. The question that both Edie and Lauren touched on when the first recommendation flashed by like a streak of lightning was about how the World Bank Group might be innovating to engage across the institution. That everybody who's spoken so far has talked about how this isn't sort of a single sector issue. So how do we do that? And in response to your question, there has been a lot of innovation on that coordination side. When the report, which was covering 2004, 2014, when that first recommendation about sort of different ways that the bank needs to work together, when that came out, it aligned pretty well with a movement already underway about cross World Bank Group collaboration in agribusiness. Unlocking agribusiness is complex. I think any of us who've worked in that sector know that. I think everybody's comment on it. It's a lot of things have to sort of kick in. It's complex, but that's okay because we're a complex organization, which means that much of what it takes, if we could bring it together, actually we're able to serve the client in this space of value chains and agribusiness development. So Lauren's already touched on in your opening comments about how important agribusiness is. Well, and so has Jürgen on the rural non-farm economy and then that on poverty reduction and the question that you raised. Getting it together in order to deliver in this space is precisely the impetus that informed the formation of the global solution groups, the GSGs, and the one on value chains and agribusiness, all of them actually in 2015. And as you said, it quickly grew to a large membership across many different GPs in the IFC at the bank. And like other much needed joint communities, like the agri-finance one that the FNM Global Practice co-hosts with the Agriculture Global Practice. Yes, the GSG was a knowledge platform. The idea was to share approaches from other parts of the bank and from other regions to other regions. But it also represented kind of a dedication or a commitment across the different GP managements and across a body of staff who were really focused on joint solutions when that made sense. It was a focus on sort of bringing innovation from different parts that were no longer innovation, say in LAC, but what could their application be in other regions, and also from different parts. And we had a really sort of tangible impact both on the knowledge agenda, but also on operations. And since you have raised like the 3-part agenda, one of them is gender, maybe I'll focus in when it comes to knowledge on the gender and agribusiness agenda, okay? There's this foundational work done by the Agriculture GP in gender and agriculture. So I'm talking about the Gender and Agriculture Sourcebook or the toolkit on gender issues in monitoring evaluation of agriculture projects. And this was complemented in 2016 by the IFC, who put out, amongst a number of other things, this piece, if you've not read it, on investing in women along the agribusiness value chain. So this is about inclusion, about what's good and evil. And they are basically making the business case for gender consideration, for gender inclusion in different parts, different businesses along the value chain. And actually, there's now an online course about it, the business case for gender smart private sector solutions. So that when thereafter the TNC gender and agribusiness guidelines were developed, it was drawing and cross-referencing on these other pieces to try to sort of give task teams a checklist or some guidelines about how to integrate that in. And especially these later pieces, they just could not have been developed, or they're not as strong or as applicable alone as they are together. And that kind of constant cross-referencing and developing in reference to each other is actually quite new. Those are 3 different parts of the bank who came together on this one really important issue about gender in agribusiness. So I think that's a good example on the knowledge front about the way that we're kind of coming together and that we're probably going to see manifest more and more in operations. But on the topic of operations, in the first 20 months of the GSG, there was this active commitment I was telling you about, this active facilitation, which resulted in more than a doubling of joint operations between Agriculture GP and TNC alone. That's just 2 GPs. And this wasn't just a question of listing 2 co-TTLs and ticking that box. It was a substantive marrying of different skill sets in the 2 GPs, right? So if you'll permit me an example, one example is Zambia. So through the GSG, this LAC Productive Alliances, Productive Partnerships teams, met with the Zambia TNC team that was working on economic diversification and private sector development. And what these two teams did with that meeting was to design a project, an innovation in project design that was just, it was new, and it was a better solution to what the client's needs were than either were going to give by themselves. So there was a marrying of this TNC model for high growth entrepreneurs, SMEs, and how that model is about sort of taking the off-taker, looking at the end market, and then building support up backward the chain. And so you had this mirror on the SME side to the Productive Alliance side, which was doing the same thing for smallholder farmers. That's a pretty complete linkages package that we hadn't been seeing before. But, and I guess there's two things there, but it may come in if there is a data discussion about sort of cross-regional fertilization as well as cross-GP. And very similar number of examples with the IFC, that it's this sort of two-way streets when it comes to agribusiness. I do have two examples. One is how the IFC is fed into bank work in innovative ways. The IFC Mass Advisory Team, I think many of you in here will be aware of that. They developed this product, this support around building sustainable supply chains between firms and smallholders. So you were speaking about sort of the market power aspects and whether value chain works or not. And the IFC Mass Advisory Team was working on these approaches and tools for sustainable supply chains and inclusive supply chains. And we hosted this workshop in the GSG to which a lot of bank task team leaders attended. And I think everybody appreciated the perspective. It's sort of a different perspective, looking at it from the firm's point of view, but still within a development organization. And a few teams had found it appropriate to the context that they were working in, and a number of projects went to board with this with these tools from the IFC after sort of hearing about them and testing them out in their own contexts. And as I said, it's a two-way street, right? I think we could probably see this most clearly, and this is what I'm going to end with, in the Cascade and in IFC 3.0. I mean, some estimates put, and you will have heard the statistic before, quite recently actually, some estimates put the investment needed to achieve food security in the agriculture SDGs in the 15 years between 2015 and 2030 to $480 billion per annum. Okay, so that's a lot. And the lion's share will obviously have to come from the private sector. And that's a realized recognition, right, in the World Bank Group through the Cascade, through IFC 3.0, and the Mass Agribusiness Strategy aligned with IFC 3.0, and the PSW. So private sector investment is needed, right? We all agree that to move the development agenda in agribusiness for sure. And so there's a real need to think about what elements constrain private sector investment, whether that investment comes from farmers, from SMEs, from IFC type of investors, or from large commercial agribusinesses writ large, right? Private sector, all of them. But there's this mix of public investment, regulation, and policy to be tailored that can unlock these elements. And that unlocking, those keys are supported by multiple teams across the World Bank Group. So I think that what's needed, since we have this very supportive framework, we have experience around this, is a kind of integrative diagnostic, right? A diagnostic that's looking at not so much what one can do or the other can do, but what's needed, and who can contribute to that from across the bank. And there too, since you asked me about innovation, I think the bank is innovating, the World Bank Group is innovating there. There are those kind of integrating diagnostics being developed now, where you can piece the elements of a solution from across the World Bank Group. And that's pretty much what's needed in this upstream development around the Cascade and around IFC 3.0. So, I mean, I just want to end with the question or the statement that, you know, is it going to be agribusiness cascade from this GP or from that GP? No, right? It's an approach to maximizing finance for development in agribusiness from the World Bank Group. And I really feel like in the last 2 years, not just this GSG, but others, we've shown that we know how to do that. We know how to work across those, and I think that needs to continue.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lorraine. Obviously, we heard from our senior management that the cascade approach is not new, it's how systematically you apply it. So I think that you are providing a very good backdrop to that. I particularly like the example that you provided, and also two things. One is food security. We might have to come back to it because there are some questions of food security that has been raised, but also the elegant way in which you were combining value change with gender in your answer. So last but not least, our second representative from management, it's my pleasure to introduce to my immediate right Martin van Nieuwkoop, who is the Director for Agricultural Global Practice, and therefore, by definition, by title, in your capacity, you are in the middle of you are in the eye of the storm. Martin provides leadership and global oversight to the agricultural sector policy, dialogue, portfolio management, and partnership relationships, covering a wide range of issues, all of them very related to the topic of today: food security and food safety, agricultural productivity and competitiveness, agribusiness and post-harvest value addition, climate resilient agriculture, and others. Now, prior to his current responsibilities, Martin held numerous managerial and leadership positions covering the bank's engagement on agriculture in Africa, Latin America, South Asia. So he has a very good regional cover. Martin is from the Netherlands and holds postgraduate degrees in agricultural economics from Wageningen University. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And business administration from Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. Now, this is the context to my question, and this links very well also with the late commentary by Lorraine. Our evaluation points to the need to maintain a strong focus on productivity. We've heard about that. Sustain increased agricultural productivity to support this bi-directional growth in farm and non-farm economy. But, and this is the connection, it also talks about the need to identify the binding constraints and address them, whether it is in the factor markets that Stephen was mentioning, whether it is infrastructure, etc., that prevent the poor from accessing opportunities. So this is it. How do you think the agricultural global practice can provide all the solutions? No, that's not the question. Can work across practices and agencies to promote this enhanced agricultural productivity while addressing these imperfections, the binding constraints, regulatory barriers that don't allow this to happen? Thank you.
Thanks, Jose, for this question, and happy to understand from the presentation that it's not up to the agricultural practice to solve all those issues on its own, but actually work with all the GPs as well to make that happen. This is a very important subject. I mean, it's a good reminder that of the evaluation that 80% of the poor live in rural areas, and that the rural non-farm economy is an important and also growing aspect in the lives of the poor. You kicked off the session, by asking how would the rural non-farm economy looks like in 2030, and I think Jürgen tried to kind of put his hands on it. I'm very optimistic. I think in 2030, you will see a very strong rural non-farm economy. At the same time, probably the boundaries of the rural non-farm economy will be less clear vis-a-vis urban and vis-a-vis farming, and I want to kind of elaborate a little bit on that. The point is that the driving force, I think, is urbanization. Urbanization is causing the agricultural production and consumption to be increasingly geographically dispersed. And causing a rapid rise in the growth of the urban food markets and a very strong demand for convenience. And therefore for agro-processing. We've done some studies, and if you look at the value added on farm vis-a-vis the value added off farm or post-harvest, typically in Africa and South Asia, that ratio is about 1-to-1. So basically the same value added on farm as off farm. But if you look, if you take the extreme example, Europe and United States, that ratio is 1-to-8 or 1-to-10. So most of the value added actually happening, off the farm and post harvest. So imagine if Africa and South Asia, between now and 2030 could move halfway. Where Europe and US are now to kind of ratio 1-to-4. That would potentially, reflect, significant potential for growth and jobs creation. And also what we see if you look at, agro-processing and agribusiness, I mean, the type of employment, it's also attractive. Very often you see women and youth actually in those enterprises. So we are very upbeat about that potential. Of course, the big question then is, how do you unlock that potential? And I think, your question is pointing in that direction. I mean, what are the binding constraints, to kind of do that? Our view here is a little bit that probably we're not sure whether it actually makes sense to think in binding constraints on kind of, and try to prioritize, what is the most binding constraint and then move on to the next binding constraint. We think there are many binding constraints. And if you resolve one binding constraint, something else very quickly becomes the next binding constraint. So basically, we need kind of approaches and solutions that enable multiple constraints and to be addressed in a kind of parallel and simultaneous fashion. And I think this is where you come to the models. I think that Stephen was mentioning, and of course the most obvious model, is the value chain approach. And I think when we talk about value chain approach now compared to maybe 4, 5, 10 years ago, I think we see kind of a shift. I think in the IAG report, it was said that there was a very strong focus on more the kind of the upstream or the production side of the value chain. But I think if you look at our portfolio, and I think also Lorraine was referring to that, you see actually a shift, and that actually there's a very much stronger focus on how can we actually access farmers to markets on the one hand, and actually how can we attract the financing to invest in the processing capacity that is needed to unlock the post-harvest value addition potential. And there are various ways in going about it. On the one hand, we're going a little bit global. We are working with DEC on the Enabling Business of Agriculture program, which now covers 40 countries and compares the regulatory quality across these countries in 6 areas. Seeds, fertilizer, machinery, finance, markets, and transport. And that helps facilitate a kind of a dialogue on policy improvements to promote private sector investments in agriculture and agribusiness. So that's one area. What you also see is that we are increasingly moving away, from, and that's just a start, it's the beginning, from our investment operations towards kind of more sector GPOs or agriculture as part of budget support operation, also increasingly P4Rs, where we actually directly engage on those policy reforms that are needed actually to provide incentives to the private sector to invest. And it also relates very much to what Lorraine was saying about the cascade. Also, with the finance and markets GP, we have a community of practice on agricultural finance, to share experience and lessons learned on agri-finance. We also had an agri-finance program until not too long ago that actually, worked with commercial banks to improve their capacity actually to lend to the agriculture sector. Another interesting thing is our work with IFC in some countries where IFC works and the bank is engaged. With private sector companies like Scoop Insights to generate credit ratings for agricultural cooperatives and producer companies that don't have a history of borrowing, from the financial sector. And to this credit ratings, actually, transaction costs to access finance will be lowered. On our investment financing, as Lorraine also said, we have a growing set of agribusiness projects together with TNC, or now FCI, that take actually a value chain approach. Promoting outgrower schemes, promoting offtake arrangements with private sector, and we think that those arrangements also are a useful platform or tool to kind of resolve multiple constraints in simultaneous fashion. Now, when it comes to the private sector, the question is: do you work with, the established companies or also, the small and medium enterprises. So a lot of the policy work that we do probably benefits, the kind of the established enterprises. So what you also see increasingly with TNC and IFC is that we support under our project agribusiness innovation centers and incubators, to provide business development services and facilitate access to finance, for SMEs. Now, on the question on the factor markets, as Stephen was saying, and how can we then make sure? Because a lot of what I'm saying so far is the kind of the growth model, and the question is, how can we then actually make sure this is translated in income growth for the poor? What I see here also is a convergence, with our livelihoods program that was mentioned also in the IEG evaluation. What we see there is that in our livelihoods programs, I would say that initially a lot of the focus was on women empowerment and capacity building. And I think that has been very successful. But what I see now, when I look at the second generation, and Parmesh can tell much more about it, if I look at the second generation of our livelihoods project that are coming forward now, is actually that they're focusing much more on income generating activities supporting the establishment of micro, small, and medium enterprises with those beneficiaries. Now, the issue is, the lesson learned there is that, okay, you need patience. This is a long-term process. Now, besides the fact that the bank is not very good in collaboration across different kind of groups in the bank, maybe our patience is also, an issue that we could do better on, because of what I see, when we engage with our, because it's demand-driven in the end, it's the country directors who, with the clients who take decisions. People are getting tired. Oh, we've done livelihoods now for the last 8 years, and can we do something else? Well, I think this is where we drop the ball. If you can stay the course at those moments, I think you will see the type of impacts I think that the IAG report was looking for. So I think this is a very important report. I think the recommendations are very relevant. I think we will be moving in the right direction. But of course, there is much more to be done, and we need to do that because the potential, as I said in my opening remarks, was that the potential is significant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for your candid and comprehensive assessment, and for allowing, also for making the link to some of the questions that have been coming through Paul F., because it was my real intention, first to open the floor to all of you, and then get the questions from Paul F. For example, one of the questions was the linkage between helping SMEs in this space, and how can we use innovative financial mechanisms to do that. And you have done that very well, also linking it with the cascade. But contrary to our expectations, this is I'm told that we have to leave the room in 10 minutes. I don't know why. So we were planning all along to complete this until 3 p.m. So I think everybody who has it's a logistical surprise, but I guess we have to abide by that. But so I have a choice to make, and therefore I'm going to be executive in this decision. The time has come for the audience to formulate questions to our distinguished panel. Please formulate the question very quickly instead of commentary. If we can get at least 4 or 5 questions all at once, and then I'll have a final round where I will allow all my panelists, and with apologies for having to rush this very interesting exercise in the last minute, but I guess we have to be adaptive. So who wants to start?
Hi, I'm Michael Morris with the Agriculture Global Practice. Great presentation and very nice comments. Just, I guess, a question to Steve about this business of growing the non-farm rural economy, and you talked about sort of 3 big avenues: consumption linkages, production linkages, and factor markets. And the examples you gave from the factor markets really are cases where people are leaving unproductive jobs in agriculture, but they have good opportunities. They go somewhere where they can make 5 times as much in the mining sector, was one of the examples you gave. I guess there's some evidence, we see it in LAC in some countries certainly, where people are leaving rural areas, but they don't really have good productive jobs to go to. And they're ending up, in cities selling cigarettes in the street and really low unproductive service industry. So I think, that can work well when you do have more productive sectors and opportunities to absorb them. But if those other jobs aren't there, you may have an issue. It may not be as effective a channel as you think. Sorry, maybe that was a comment rather than a question.
That's all right.
We are used to that in this place. It's a very good comment. This last question. But can I take 2 more, and maybe to maximize the number of people that can formulate questions, can you be brief and then quickly, and then 2 more questions, please, if there are candidates for asking. So we have Bekele, please.
Thank you very much. Just following up on Mike's question here as well. I guess one of the key issues in terms of these linkages to be sustainable is for productivity growth in both sectors, in the agriculture sector as well as in the non-farm sector, to be sustained, and especially the income and finance which can be generated from the non-farm sector to be able to be invested in the farming sector. And that is crucially important, as you indicated, for example, in the case of the West African case where farmers were actually increasingly using herbicides. In some of the studies I have seen recently, in Uganda, for example, Nigeria, actually that sort of positive synergy between the 2 sectors is not always happening. There is a negative relationship between what is happening in the non-farm sector. The increase in income in the non-farm sector is not being invested to grow productivity in the agriculture sector. So what should be done to sustain that productivity growth in both sectors?
Thank you. The person who just asked the question is a colleague from IG. His name is Bekele Shiferab. He didn't. Okay. Now, please.
Thank you very much. Astrid Jacobs from the German Embassy. I'm kind more of a listener here. Thank you. I guess the ag sector is really in front of a revolution. Someone on the panel mentioned the green revolution, and what is going on with the new technologies in the ag sector. There is another revolution going on. And I think this revolution in countries like the US, in Europe, but especially in other, will depend on the framework conditions. There is a lot of need for data need new infrastructures to be transmitted and so on. I guess I don't need to go into this. So what would be, or are there possibilities for the World Bank to help with these kind of infrastructural questions? And then the other one, I just have been to a meeting on research, agricultural research. And here in the US, people are saying we have to invest more in agricultural research. It's not about enhancing our productivity, it's just to keep the levels of productivity. So how are we going and keeping up with these aspects? And is there a role for research? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Why don't we start with you, Stephen, and if you can sort of. It's very difficult because the questions that I put to you are quite broad, but we have limited time. Perhaps we can get a few extra. I mean, as long as we are not kicked out, we can just go on. This is we will squatter. It reminds me a little bit of the ups and downs in the Alabama voting 2 nights ago.
Okay, just very quickly, I can tie Mike and Bekele and the infrastructure question. Poor people go to the urban city even if they don't have a job. I think a lot of the answer to that is invest in rural towns, invest in some alternate growth poles so that they don't all have to go to Buenos Aires or Dar es Salaam. I think, and that's where I think the bank can really play a valuable role. There needs to be some diagnostic organizing framework locally centered around, I think, these regions and regional growth poles, and then somebody can fund the electricity and somebody else can fund the roads, and you need some local coordinating mechanism to make sure it all fits together okay. But I think focusing some of your efforts in rural towns, middle-sized towns, which is spatially where a lot of these connections take place, where a lot of the processing that Martin's talking about is going to take place, but they're going to need electricity and water and sanitation to make that work. So I would recommend that. But Kelly, what if they make money and they don't invest in farming? And where I've seen that happen is where farming is a lousy investment. Very interesting comparisons of Ethiopia and Kenya. And if you look at Kenyans, they go and they make money in urban areas, and a lot of them buy farms because they can make very good money in export horticulture and so on. Jim McCann and other Ethiopia specialists worry, why isn't the same thing happening in Ethiopia? And I think it has to do with incentive structures and opportunities. So yes, you do need research in agriculture. It needs to be productive and attractive in order to attract investment both ways. So that your answer comes from the woman in front. You need to invest in ag productivity.
Thank you very much, Steve. Jürgen, do you want to comment on some of the or any of the questions that have been raised?
Yes, thank you. Perhaps two issues. I think one is you need to have some better understanding where the sources of growth and where the potential is, and probably that's very country specific. But you need to have a closer look on the binding constraints, and this should be done in a more comprehensive way. Also, a spatial planning has been mentioned. I think that's something we neglected, perhaps. I also remember the WDR a few years ago on geography. Yeah, I think this was one of the best, and there I think it can have many implications. For example, I come from Bavaria, and this was after the Second World War. It was a rural country. The economy was based on agriculture, but now it's a high-tech country. So what happened? And I think some of the things happened, what you just also discussed and suggested. For example, there was a concept of what we called Feierabendbauern. So it's one gave the possibility to farmers to work at the same time in some factories after work. So it was kind of part-time, farmer part-time, and they could go with buses to the next rural towns and get some income. And the income they used to scale up their farms. Another point is transport and connectivity. So, for example, when I was in the apartment of my grandparents, I looked out of the window, and every morning 100 buses arrived, and they brought these people from the rural areas to the towns where the same happened. So this kind of spatial planning, but also in the sense that for example, if one source of or linkage is agrobusiness, agro-processing, then one perhaps shouldn't just let it happen like that, but one should kind of promote that these capacities are closer to the rural areas and not in the big cities. And there are certainly some incentives to do that, but it would have many advantages. And also looking at, for example, what in Africa happened with the population growth, probably we don't want that these 2 billion new population goes to the urban cities, because also there the income generating possibilities aren't there due to the lack of industrialization. And therefore, we would probably need some incentives that these capacities stay closer to the rural areas. And then there is another problem linked to it. When you look at countries like China, for example, there we have similar problem, but in a way also the other way around. There, all the people went from the rural areas to the urban centers. Now, many of them go back because of many reasons. One reason is also that they are pushed out of the towns. And the government has strong incentives that they go back. So how this can be done in a sensible way. For China is, reversing this trend. For Africa, it would be to avoid that the trend becomes a reality. And I think these are really new challenges, and there is new. I think there is really a need to look more in depth on that, and that's my second point: knowledge. Of course, there is some general knowledge and analytics we need, but also very much country specific. And my understanding is that the new setup in the World Bank, in principle, is a good setup to promote the flow of knowledge across regions and across sectors. And now with the cascade and all this new dynamic, perhaps there is more cooperation amongst IBRD, IFC, MIGA. For the time being, it's just, a little bit of wishful thinking. But okay, you protest. We have made great progress, but there is still some way to go. Yeah. But I think that's what has to be done. And there is one specific issue linked to it. And that's a very, one of our top priorities, and also discussing now the package and capital increase and the reform in different areas of the bank. Knowledge is a global public good. And there are other global public goods. And we feel that this task and mandate of the World Bank to work on best practice, to work on knowledge, to work on global public goods, is not really very well reflected in the business model and in the different instruments. We always find, these situations where we are told, it's nice, but we don't have the funds for that. It's a country-driven model, which is good, but we have to look a little bit beyond this country-driven model. And global public good, by definition, almost, needs an instrument which goes beyond the country. And I think that's something we bring into the current debate, and it's very much linked to the issue we are discussing today.
Many thanks, Jürgen. We are now in borrowed time, but I think that we should have a final word, and Lorraine has kind enough to give the floor to Martin for final words before I conclude. Thank you.
Thanks. Just to respond to a few questions on the, just to underscore and emphasize what Stephen is saying as well in response to the question on agricultural research. What you see in our client countries is that actually they're underinvesting in ag research. Actually, even if expenditures are growing, it's basically subsidies that actually has shown very strong growth since the food price crisis about 10 years ago. So there's definitely, a very strong argument, to kind of scale up spending on ag research. And particularly also, in view of the effect of climate change, because I think that's the reason why people are saying that, okay, you need to invest in ag research to keep the same productivity, because there's this effect of climate change. And in that sense, climate smart, climate resilient agriculture is really a priority for the agriculture global practice, and be working with all the GPs on that agenda as well. The green revolution, the technology agenda, I think, very interesting. And it raises also some questions, because, with the whole development on hydroponics, for instance, agriculture is also moving into urban areas. And what does that mean for rural non-farm economy? We haven't discussed that, but I think it's a very relevant question. And, And I agree, what I'm trying to say, I agree on the maximizing financing for development. I think it's a good opportunity for the bank and IFC and MIGA to better work together. And actually, we are working with IFC on seeing actually what does maximizing financing for development means for agriculture. And that should be then an approach not just for the bank, but also for IFC and MIGA. So we're kind of working on that as we speak. Thanks.
So you must have appreciated the dynamics, very interesting dynamics. That way we didn't, have the moderator in the middle. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. I just want to say three things very quickly. As I said, we are in borrowed time. So first of all, is apologies for having to cut this short. I think the themes and the dimensions are so interesting, particularly to those people following us through CoLEV who have formulated very interesting questions regarding the role of technology and disruptive innovations, food security. We have left the possibility of talking about diagnostic tools, data, knowledge, all of these issues interrelated, whether we should be promoting education or entrepreneurial skills. Again, as we were saying before, the role of SMEs in rural areas, how do we improve on the financing side, etc. It comes to show how interesting the wide scope of this topic and how much more we can do. A victim of this curtailing of our time has been my colleague and also co-TTL Andrew Stone, who was planning to do concluding remarks, but I guess we'll have to leave it for another occasion. And last but not least, I just want to thank all of you for being here and all the panel members for having spent their time as Wyndham with us. If we can give them a show of hands.